Hey everyone, welcome to another Angry Artist podcast. In this podcast, I'm about to give you an idea that will improve your art immensely, and it doesn't really require learning anything. It's the idea of using reference. When I mean reference, I mean using photography, using videos, maybe even use your surroundings as inspirations, and to pretty much fact check in the art world. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of artists out there who already know about this stuff, and of course, that's a good thing. However, I noticed a lot of people, especially when you check out their work, and it feels like they could have improved their art simply by getting reference. I know a lot of people get the impression that having reference is a bad thing. It's sort of like an ego destroyer. You want to feel like you know what something looks like. And when you're drawing, you might be a little bit stubborn. You might get into a trap of being too confident in your own knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't any problems with just learning the anatomy and really doing things out of your imagination. There's a lot of art theory that you need to know in order to use reference in the best way possible. You don't want to get into a habit of being a photocopier. Even if you have very strong fundamentals, I almost assure you every professional will say their work will be better with reference than without. And these are really high caliber and very knowledgeable professionals. I'm about to tell you why. If you've listened to my other podcasts, I've deduced painting to be just a series of decisions that you have to make. In any given artwork, there are a lot of aspects to consider. And a lot of cases, you must be able to do things subconsciously. For instance, when you're painting and designing a character, you're most likely going to have anatomy and other of the structural and volumetric ideas subconsciously, and you're probably thinking about the design itself. No matter how smart you really are, your brain can really only think about one or even several things at most at the same time. So when you're doing art, it's sort of like putting a lot of things in your subconscious and thinking about that one thing that really matters. When you get to a professional level, that one thing tends to be ideas or the concept of your piece. When you get all the technical knowledge out of the way, ultimately art is just the message. So, what does this have to do with reference? Well, reference is actually a fantastic way of making you think less about certain aspects. So, for instance, let's say you have a photo of a pose and you're trying to design a character and costuming on top of this pose. By the sheer fact that you've gotten a reference photo, you're able to ignore the pose, you're able to ignore the structure, you're able to ignore basically the surface level of what you're given. This will allow your brain to focus on your design. Of course, it's not the end all be all answer. You're probably going to have to still be wary of the anatomy and really make sure that you don't make any mistakes from seeing the reference. However, again, because you have something to look at, you're able to solve a myriad of problems that you don't really have to think about. Remember, our brains are limited. No matter how hard we try, we're gonna have problems when we paint. And that comes from simply having too many problems you're trying to solve at the same time. It's sort of like having a completely filled schedule, and you're trying to find ways to skim through everything, and that's really not the best way of doing your job. The other reason why that referencing is very important is because let's say you are the greatest artist in the world and your library of knowledge is very, very high. Having reference is a very good way of expanding it. When you're drawing something out of your head, you fall into the tendency of using the same things from your brain library. So, what I mean by that is, let's say you're trying to draw a woman's face. Everyone has their own impressions of what a woman's face looks like and what they're most comfortable with. Of course, I'm not saying that maliciously. Everyone has their own way of seeing women and what they're used to around them. And that could be cultural too, depending on where you live and depending on what if ethnicity you are. So when you go and want to make artwork of this, you're gonna find yourself, hey, maybe you're using the same symbols every single time, and your female faces are looking way too similar. I call it the same face syndrome, but it applies to a ton of things, and it could include inanimate objects. When I was working in a studio a while back, I actually had that situation. I thought I knew what a tree looked like, but when my boss looked at it, he told me to get more reference and to really come back with a better design. And it really astounded me because I was sure I understood what a tree looks like. Until, of course, I Googled it. Now, in this particular era, we're able to Google everything, so there's really no excuse. My stubbornness made me think I knew what a tree actually looks like. And of course, I could maybe draw a tree out of my head that's very convincing. But it just wouldn't be natural. Something will always be wrong about it. Now, again, I'm not endorsing trying to copy what you look up. And that's definitely not my intention. However, having photos beside you will help you create better designs. And it goes without saying that by doing so, you can study what you see and then you're able to make your own designs based on the patterns of everything that you've looked up. And really, that's the ultimate goal. When you want to expand your knowledge of design, you have to be able to get a ton of variety and a ton of samples. Study everything. I've said this many times in my previous podcasts, but study everything. Nothing beats observation. Now, to conclude this particular podcast, I wanted to mention one more thing. If you're lucky to have life drawing, you realize even though you have the model in front of you, that it's incredibly hard to capture the model. So it comes down to this. You have to balance between observation and your knowledge of your subject. If you get reference and you don't understand how the human body works, it becomes very, very hard, even with reference, to make a convincing human body. And that applies for everything. Remember your fundamentals, and you can expand them by using reference photos. And trust me, as I said in the beginning, by listening to this, I hope I've inspired you to use reference, because I guarantee you, if you use more and more reference, and there's never going to be enough. You're going to make your next piece much better than your previous one. Anyways, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.